Okay, so we kind of left off with video art that was done in analog, so before the advent of digital media. And now we'll be talking about video art that has been done digitally, which is a relatively new media. Um, and we can just let me get to the right slide here, get started talking about digital video art. So basically that old school rounded TV screen has been replaced by the flat screen monitor, and videotape cassettes have been replaced by streaming services such as Netflix, Hulu, and DVDs as well. Even DVDs are kind of out now though. So given the ease of shooting and editing digital video today, the line between video art and cinematography has really blurred. So we have 5 movies, kind of an interesting set of movies that I've never heard of it until I read about it in this book, but Cremaster Cycle by Matthew Barney. It was originally shot on digital video, and then usually it's projected in art galleries, but part of the Cremaster series, Cremaster 3, was actually released on DVD at one point. And so these Cremaster 3 actually came out in 2002, and we have a production still of it here. And it's very visually a stunning movie. Really elaborate, symbolic storylines. It was really expensive to produce. And the series of the movies were made over an eight-year period from 1994 to 2002. And the full series was released in a limited series of 20 sets of DVDs. So it came out super limited. And each one of them sold for at least $100,000 each. So very, very expensive. And so the packaging was custom fine art packaging. It wasn't printed. It was like custom made packaging. So it was definitely not a mass marketed movie. It was very underground, very avant-garde. So in 2007, one disc was sold for $500,000. So that is pretty crazy to think about. These films are not available to watch anywhere, and they're only available via periodic screenings. So describing the plot of any of these movies is very difficult, but the plot seems to be really a lot less important than the actual symbolic content of the movie. And a portion of the movie was released on DVD. It's called, this portion was called The Order, and it recounts an endurance test that the apprentice must undergo by passing 4 ordeals of various levels at the Guggenheim Museum. And the apprentice ends up passing each obstacle and thus gains the right to kill another character in the story called the Architect. And then the murder takes place in the Chrysler Building, which is kind of a famous building. But the building itself takes revenge on the apprentice by killing him. So just strange storylines. So there's been some, reactions, pretty sharply divided on this movie from critics. Some think it's terrible. Some think it's actually amazing. Some people say, it inspires both awe and revulsion, oftentimes simultaneously. So it's really has garnered some different opinions from different critics. So some think that the Cremaster Cycle by Matthew Barney is the first truly great piece of cinema to be made in a fine art context since Dali and Buñuel filmed Un Chien Andalou in 1929. It is the most imaginative and brilliant achievements of the history of avant-garde cinema. Some people really think it's great. And then some people say this. I have quite a few quotes from critics because it's all over the place. But some say it's a mostly tedious succession of striking but vacant imagery whose effects diminish the longer you look at it. So it's definitely been back and forth with critics whether they enjoy it or not. But it does, one thing about it that it definitely does have is it's got a lot of really strong visuals. So as you can see from this still from the movie, it's very striking and fantastical, and really amazing sets. So they work well as parts of installations and galleries, but they don't really, some people don't think the plot really works very well. So Moving on from the series, the Cremaster series, so many artists today combine digital video with other art forms into like multimedia installations, such as Diana Thater. She created a dramatically lit installation for her video work Science Fiction. So basically, it's in the center of one blue lit room, and then there's a tall rectangular box that seems to float around or above an intense yellow glow. So you can kind of see that here. And then that box actually houses a projector, which sends onto the ceiling a movie that depicts living dung beetles, basically. And these insects live and move chiefly in manure, and then they guide their motions at night by the position of the Milky Way. So this is how they actually work like in the wild. So they actually use the Milky Way to move around and find their way around in where they live. And so then in the next room, there's kind of a large format screen showing the night sky that's shot through a microscope. And the installation kind of brings together the most elemental worlds and kind of is hearkening to the symbolic, like infinite cosmos, basically, and how the dung beetle ties into that, which is kind of a lowly creature, really, but in the grand scheme of things, it's very tied into the cosmos, obviously, if it's using the Milky Way to navigate. So kind of an interesting piece, really. Came out in 2014. So it's basically, this is an installation piece. So moving on, digital art forms. So the art-making capacity of computer-linked equipment ranges from producing finished art, such as color prints, movies, videos, and generating ideas for works that are ultimately going to be made in a different media. So artists actually began using computers as soon as they came out into wide use. So basically, the first computer-generated digital imagery took place at a private art gallery in 1965. So that's a long time ago. And then few claimed it was art, much like a lot of new art media that come out. You know, it takes a while to take on a life of its own, and where people actually respect it as an art form. But so most of the early digital artists used computers to make drawings with a plotter, which is a small ink-bearing device that moves over a piece of paper that draws a line in one color according to programmed instructions. So it's a very early, I guess you could think of it as a very early printer. So the computers that did these early digital these early digital artists used were expensive. And then, so they were only typically, these really early computers also took up whole rooms too. They were huge and they were expensive. And a lot of times they were owned by, universities or corporations or research centers. So getting access to one as an artist would have been a bit of a challenge early in the day because people didn't have personal computers at home at first. So we'll talk about Vera Molnar, Parcours from 1976. And it's basically kind of an early effort using a computer to program an image that was actually printed by a plotter, which is an early printer, basically. So this was done by Vera in a research lab in Paris. And it came out with some pretty visually interesting, piece here, Parcours. And it's very early for computer art, 1976, like I said earlier. The computer was programmed to create randomized variations of a basic set of plotter movements that yielded a work that resembles a quick drawing done by hand almost, except with more regularity, I would say. So the computer used was expensive and complex technology in those days. Which kept all but a very few select artists from actually using the medium because it was just hard, like I said, for them to gain access. So the advent of faster computers, color printers, interactive graphics radically changed the scenario in basically around the mid-1980s. And As computer capabilities grew, more artists began to use them and take interest in them. And so today, as we know, many photographers, directors, designers, sculptors, architects actually use a computer to to aid with their projects that they make. And then, so for some artists, software and digital equipment are basically an essential piece of their puzzle. So we can take a look at a few recent projects that show some of the pathways that artists are taking that are utilizing basically digital media. So we'll talk about Raphael, Lozano hammer, Vectorial elevation, his piece at Vectorial elevation. So he kind of makes dramatic, digitally based works that really engage viewers directly in the creative process. So in his 1999 work, which is actually, kind of a while ago, this was actually installed in the central square of Mexico City during the night. And it was up for several nights thereafter, and viewers could program an array of powerful searchlights by visiting terminals at the square, and then viewers worldwide could actually go to a website also and mess with the programming, which would actually change the position of the searchlights. And so they were kind of placed in a queue, and then they were carried out in sequence. So basically first come, first serve. And each array was held for about 6 seconds. And the website actually would display the name and location of the array's creator. So it was very kind of an interactive piece, but it was also incorporating, digital technology with the internet, and then also people that were there in person. So it was kind of an interesting piece, really. So the artist merely kind of designed the setup and the apparatus so anyone could share the responsibility of creation, of moving these light beams around, really. Which is, I've never really heard of anything like this, but it's a really kind of a neat idea. Many digital artists also take advantage of the computer's ability to process massive amounts of data. So we'll talk about Casey Ree's Today's Ideology from 2015. So she actually created Today's Ideology in 2015. It's basically a video screen connected to a database of one day's photos from the digital edition of the New York Times. So the computer actually distorts and displays these photos by laying them out slowly across the screen in order, and they kind of look like animated paint strokes, actually. So there's some sort of code in the background that's turning it into animated paint strokes. So basically it's using that database from the New York Times and using the photos from the day to create this art, which is kind of interesting. The distended photos are often stretched out thinly, but the bright colors and contemporary content give the viewers a new and unique perspective on contemporary events, basically. So this is kind of what it ends up looking like. She's put the code in there to kind of stretch the images and layer them, and almost ends up looking very painterly. But this is just updated every day depending on what photos are being uploaded into the database, basically, which is kind of a neat idea. So we'll kind of move on from here, talk about another artist, Lynn Hirschman Leeson. She confronts the issue of digital simulation when she created a video cyborg called Dina. So the title comes from the phrase digital DNA. So Dina appears on a video installation in which viewers walk up to a microphone and interact with the virtual woman on the screen. And then Dina is running for the imaginary office of telepresident, and her slightly disembodied cyber voice, she invites viewers to use the microphone to raise questions and concerns. So it's basically a digital woman that's running for kind of a fictitious office. So kind of an interesting idea, telepresident. So kind of combining, the idea of politics and a cyborg woman. Does she have the right to run for office? Is she human enough. It does end up kind of raising some questions.